Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. Last Saturday, I attended a demonstration at Leeds Dock in which my constituents, leaseholders affected by this scandal, talked about the anxiety, the stress and the potentially crippling financial costs that face them if they're asked to pay to fix their homes. And they really feel that nothing has changed. Now, if they'd been able to see Ted Baillie from Victoria State, referred to by the Father of the House earlier, speak last week, I mean, they would have been blown away by his direct, no-nonsense approach. And those three words, find, fix, fund, and then go after the people who are responsible, should be the guiding light of the government's approach. And my question to ministers is, when are we going to take, here in the UK, the kind of comprehensive approach that we're seeing in Victoria, in Australia? And I appreciate we all do the money that the government is putting in. But there are so many other faults on buildings, apart from unsafe cladding, that replacing the cladding isn't going to make them safe. Take one example, the Richmond house fire, just under 2 years ago, below 18 metres. And yet we're told it was the absence of proper cavity barriers and fire breaks which allowed the fire to spread. And I say to members, watch the video. It's absolutely terrifying. Luckily, nobody was killed. And yet, it is precisely fire defects of that sort, which have been discovered on countless buildings, as we know, that are not covered by the government's funding offer, because the government is funding the removal of dangerous cladding. So if they aren't fixed, and ministers know, we've told them time and time again, leaseholders don't have the money to pay to fix those defects, then those buildings will remain classed as unsafe. Presumably, if they're a serious risk, they will continue to have waiting watch and insurance bills, which will drain the accounts of innocent leaseholders. The second point I want to make is, where's the plan to manage the most dangerous buildings first? Because at the moment, the order in which they're fixed depends on the speed with which managing agents and freeholders either pay themselves or apply to the Building Safety Fund. We don't actually know the full extent of the problem. There is no comprehensive list. And offering 15 years instead of 6, well, fine, but it's useless, because not a single leaseholder I've spoken to is going to be able to put the money up, take the risk to sue someone when they might lose after 7 years and face another bill. They've got enough to worry about at the moment. And I look forward to working with others on a cross-party basis to support amendments to this bill, so finally my leaseholders can look at the bill when it's finished and say, right, we have a plan to deal with this, so that all of our constituents can get on with their lives, because that is what they want and what they deserve.
Aldous.
Deputy Speaker, technically speaking, the issue that I wish to highlight, the need for there to be more widespread fitting of sprinklers, does not fit neatly within the current narrow scope of this bill. But with some amendment it can, and quite frankly it is a matter that has been ignored for far too long, and it is appropriate to highlight it in a second reading debate on building safety. 10 years ago, this month, the Wessex Foods factory on the South Lowestoft industrial estate was burnt to the ground. Fortunately, no one lost their lives, but 150 people lost their jobs, surrounding businesses were seriously disrupted, and it took 10 days to fully extinguish the fire, during which every firefighter in Suffolk attended the scene. And 52 million litres of water was used, much of it finding its way in a contaminated form into nearby watercourses. This turmoil would have been avoided if the factory had been fitted with sprinklers. If it had been, the firefighters who had first attended the scene would have spent just 4 minutes on site. In the intervening 10 years, what has been done to promote the greater use of sprinklers? In previous parliaments, we've had good debates, ably led by our former colleague Jim Fitzpatrick and my honourable friend, the member for Southend West, but nothing has been achieved. In fact, we are going backwards, as the government is proposing changes to the Building Bulletin 100 Schools Fire Safety Guidance, which will mean that automatic fire sprinkler systems will only be required in a very limited number of schools, far fewer than intended under the current BB 100. Madam Deputy Speaker, despite urban myths, the case for sprinklers is compelling. They save lives, they save jobs, and they prevent environmental degradation. Some people may worry about their cost, but I don't deny that in some circumstances retrofitting will present challenges, but making their use mandatory will unleash innovation through both increased manufacturing and the enhanced design and layout of buildings. Madam Deputy Speaker, a small but significant step to achieving the more widespread use of sprinklers is to use this bill to amend both the 1984 Building Act and the 2010 Building Regulations so as to give the Secretary of State the power to make regulations to facilitate the protection of property. I would urge the Government to seriously consider this when the bill is in committee. Thank you.
And by video link, Rebecca Long-Bailey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Sadly, this bill is deficient in many areas. It focuses on higher risk buildings currently defined as those over 18 metres, so leaving the safety of residents in buildings under 18 metres unclear. Further, does today's EWS1 announcement now mean that combustible cladding under 18 metres should be ignored? On the issue of funding, this is still not adequately addressed. As the government well knows, the Building Safety Fund only covers unsafe cladding, yet 70% of buildings surveyed have non-cladding fire safety defects. Providing cladding remediation funding for buildings over 18 metres, yet forcing leaseholders in buildings under 18 metres to pay is simply unjust. And as Inside Housing has previously reported, even those minority of leaseholders who could apply for loans potentially face waiting years. For social landlords, as the National Housing Federation states, social housing providers will be forced to draw money from improving tenants' homes and communities to fund remediation. This is staggering. To address these inequities, of course, the government's answer is to simply extend limitation periods to 15 years. But this will still require leaseholders and social landlords to stump up the initial costs themselves if they don't qualify for the Building Safety Fund. Legal processes for the recovery of such funds could, of course, take years and be very costly, and that's if the developers and contractors even still exist. This proposal wouldn't help leaseholders in my constituency at Transport House who face bills of over £100,000 each. They fall shy of the 15-year period, nor would it help the tenants and residents of Sovereign Point. And aside from the unsafe conditions such residents are forced to live in every day, the mental strain takes its toll. In a survey by UK Cladding Action Group, 90% of leaseholders said their mental health has deteriorated, and a fifth have had thoughts of suicide and self-harm. So let's be clear, the only way to protect both leaseholders and tenants from the unfair costs of a crisis they did not cause is for the government to provide upfront remediation funding, then recoup the costs from those responsible for those safety defects. As we've heard, they managed to do that in Australia, so this government can manage to do it here. Thank you.
Since October last, the all-party parliamentary Group for Fire Safety and Rescue, which I chair, and I'm delighted to see so many members of the group participating in this debate. We've responded in detail to 4 government consultations on various aspects of fire and building safety. A further consultation was launched by the Department for Education on the 27th of May in relation to revised fire safety design guide for new schools, which in a nutshell proposes to remove in the future the requirement for automatic fire sprinkler protection but a very few new schools. This is not acceptable, and I'm delighted it was raised at Prime Minister's question today. We are suffering from consultation overload, and we could really do with a roadmap as to how all these pieces of work actually fit together. Last Thursday was my 3rd meeting with the Noble Lord Greenhouse on fire and building related issues since the 23rd of June. Only last week, during a joint meeting I chaired with the Disability APPG, we both heard a most distressing account of a disabled resident trapped on the 23rd floor of Grenfell Tower, whose son carried her down through the smoke and flames at 2:30 a.m. 1.5 hours into the fire, her husband tragically perished, having jumped from the building. One significant issue raised by both the All-Party Parliamentary Group and the National Fire Chiefs Council in our previous responses to the Fire Safety Order consultation was that there remains a fundamental disconnect between the non-worsening conditions of building regulations and the expectations of continuous improvements through the fire risk assessment process set by the Fire Safety Order. Section 4 of the Building Regulations 2010 states that where the work did not previously comply with Schedule 1, that when the new work is complete, it should be no more unsatisfactory in relation to that requirement than before the work was carried out, meaning the general fire precautions may never get improved to modern standards. This runs contrary to the principles of prevention outlined in the Fire Safety Order, that premises risk assessment should adapt to technical progress and reduce overall risk within buildings. Non-worsening provisions are resulting in lost opportunities to improve building safety. An example is the refurbishment of Nakalala House following a multiple fatal fire. The London Fire Commissioner told the coroner that automatic fire sprinkler protection would have prevented the death of 6 residents who died if it had been installed. Subsequently, the coroner recommended to the then Secretary of State that he should encourage social housing providers in high-rise blocks over 80 metres to consider retrofitting automatic sprinkler protections. And I say to my honourable friend, the Minister, we must never make the same mistakes again.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and the warmest congratulations as well. I think everybody welcomes the new and enhanced regulatory regimes for building safety in this bill. But as many members have already stated, I'm more concerned, or I'm equally concerned about the action that's needed now to make existing homes and products safe and to stop leaseholders from being hit with catastrophic bills from building owners to fix historic failures. I would also like to put on record my concerns about a statement being issued in the middle of an opening speech presenting this bill. I do think it is appalling, absolutely appalling. But I'd like to move on specifically about Dame Judith Hackett's report and how she concluded that it was the construction industry prevalent culture which was undermining building safety. Judith referred to procurement regimes which were not fit for purpose in relation to building safety. She added, unhelpful behaviours such as contract terms and payment practices which prioritise speed and low-cost solutions exacerbate this situation. She concluded that poor procurement and payment practice not only provide poor value for money, but they also produce poor building safety outcomes. She recommended that contracts, payment terms and practices should be recorded as part of a proposed digital building safety file. And I couldn't agree more with her conclusions. The toxic culture in too many parts of the construction industry where fly-by-night firms benefit by accepting the lowest priced jobs achieved by poor payment practices to their supply chain. This bill provides a unique opportunity for not just to deal with the scandal of unsafe buildings, but also the scandal of the manipulation of late payment practices by large, unscrupulous construction companies. Evidence given to committees of this House following the Carillion collapse revealed the appalling abuse of Tier 1 contractors like Carillion. But in spite of my bill in 2019 to tackle the misery so many small construction companies continue to face and protect them from becoming insolvent, as nearly 1,000 did after Carillion's demise, absolutely nothing has been done. Almost 6 years on from the Business Department reviewing the practice of retentions which harms thousands of small businesses by depriving them of much needed cash flow, it has sat on its hands. Based on figures provided by the Department in October 2017, every day almost £1 million worth of retentions is lost by firms, mainly small businesses, because of upstream insolvencies. Today, according to insolvency specialists, almost 100,000 firms in the industry are under severe financial stress. Small construction firms are having to grapple with the massive cost pressures of their base, and many are facing the issues that I've talked about. If an industry is free of widespread and egregious treatment, all right, thank you.
Felicity Buchan.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I welcome this bill, and it will be very important in transforming our regime of building safety and, very importantly, putting residents and high-rises at the forefront of that regime. Building safety is incredibly important to me. The tragedy of Grenfell Tower happened in my constituency, and London is home to 55% of all high-rises and intermediate buildings, many of which lie in central London. I hope this bill will also change the culture of the building industry and the building products industry. I have been shocked by some of the revelations coming out of the Grenfell inquiry, how the system was gamed, how it was pushed to the nth degree, and we need to change that culture. Residents and safety need to come first. There are many points of this bill that I warmly welcome. I welcome the building products regulator and the ability of that regulator to take building products off the market and to prosecute those who try and sell products that do not meet the mark. I also welcome the fact that the time period to sue for defective premises will go from 6 years to 15 years. And I believe the announcement that we heard this afternoon on EWS 1 forms is going to be critical. Now, clearly there are details that we need to get confirmation on. RICS guidance is going to be very important. It's going to be very important just to have confirmation that the advance notice will be withdrawn, and we also need clarity as to what will happen to EWS 1 forms which have already been issued, and will they stay or will they not. But I think that this is potentially a very, very significant development for leaseholders. There are issues that we across the House need to work on. We need to agree the scope. Yes, it applies currently to buildings above 18 metres, but the bill has the capacity to increase that scope, so we need to focus on that. And very importantly, I think that we need a task force within MHCLG that will look at buildings case by case, because there are so many buildings that are throwing up very unique circumstances that we need to deal with. One is Collier House in my constituency. Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker.
Alison Thewliss.
Mr Deputy Speaker, and I want to speak just briefly on a few issues that affect my constituents. First of all, I want to ask the Minister on the issue of Barnett consequentials. And I heard the intervention earlier on from a Welsh colleague who asked the Chancellor about the quantum of Barnett consequentials for Wales. And the Minister said back that the Welsh Government haven't devised a scheme for existing consequentials yet. Now, this becomes a bit of a kind of strange paradox, because it would be daft for a government on a fixed budget to commit to something spending more than they have, and they can't plan for that. And if a devolved administration were to establish a scheme without that certainty the money was coming, they would then be considered irresponsible. So I think it needs to be made clear what those additional consequentials are for the devolved administrations. Now, the Scottish Government has proceeded on the basis of the £97 million allocated to the Scottish Parliament for this, and have set up the Scottish Government Single Building Assessment Scheme. And I pay tribute to Kevin Stewart's MSP, who as Minister spearheaded a lot of this work. And that scheme is prioritising by risks. They've had over 100 expressions of interest in that scheme. But in order to make sure that that scheme reaches as far as it can do, those consequentials have to be absolutely clear so that the problem can be tackled as far as it can. I'd like to take the opportunity also to pay tribute to those in my constituents who have championed their fellow residents. Lisa Murray of the Verdi Residents Group, Hector Thompson and Barry Cooper of the Lansfield Quay Residents Association also. And Hector and Barry told me the difficulties that they have had in obtaining building insurance for the development they're part of. There are hundreds of flats in that development, and their insurance got withdrawn suddenly on the 23rd of December 2020, leaving them very worried over the Christmas period about what would happen. And contrary to what the Secretary of State has said in previous answers, there is a failure in the market here. And he'd mentioned Aviva, but my understanding is that Aviva has a limit of £50 million, whereas Lancefield Quay needs £75 million. Aviva, I understand, also have a bar on commercial property as part of that, and sure enough there's an Indian restaurant at the bottom of Lancefield Quay which would exempt them from getting coverage through Aviva if that is indeed the case. So I would ask the Minister to solve this situation. People are being offered insurance which is comprehensive but entirely unaffordable, or just about the realms of affordable, and not to everybody, because I know at Lancefield Quay there are some people that just can't afford the payments for that insurance, but without the comprehensive coverage which they feel they need. And there are implications for proceeding without adequate coverage for your mortgage as well, because if you are not properly insured on your property, that has implications also, I understand, for your mortgage. So the Minister needs to look at these issues and find some kind of solution, because it is not working at present, and this bill does nothing to address that. I would also ask the Minister to look at issues for VAT and building materials, because at the moment the government is profiting from the work that is being done and residents are not.
Wind-ups will begin at 6:40. For Mr Ainsbury, 6:50 then for the Government Minister. Video link, Brendan Clarke-Smith.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Firstly, I would like to say that I do believe this bill is the right one to be dealing with the cladding issue, and I fully appreciate why the Fire Safety Bill is not necessarily the right vehicle. And there's plenty to celebrate in this bill, and I think this is something we must recognise. And I particularly welcome the announcement in this House from the Secretary of State today on the use of the EWS1 forms, and that these will not be required for buildings below 18 metres. I know people would like some clarification on cases where the EWS1 forms already exist and whether these will now be voided or not. So that is something that we would like to hear more on. And the clarification that there's no systemic risk for buildings under 18 metres and that the market is expected to now act as normal, leading to a market correction, is also welcome. And it's the extreme risk aversion that has caused some of these issues, as Dame Judith Hackett referred to, and it's something we can now start to address. I think it's encouraging to hear from the Secretary of State that lenders have welcomed this clarification, and now making sure we take other players in the market with us, including insurers, is the next logical step. And as my right honourable friend, the chair of the HCLG Select Committee, has mentioned, we do thank the Secretary of State and his department for responding to the points that we have raised and acting on the vast majority of those recommendations and taking our comments into account. Of course, one of those principles we've always held is the principle that leaseholders should not pay. And the Building Safety Fund is very welcome, and £5.1 billion will go a long way to satisfying many of the problems before us. And the £30 million Waking Watch Fund is a great help, although I think we all realise there are still issues that some will see as unresolved. And it's important to recognise that this bill is about far more than cladding, however. We've already announced new robust legal requirements on builders and the materials they use, which is something very much needed and follows the recommendations from the Grenfell inquiry. And giving homeowners the right to retrospectively seek compensation for up to 15 years for shoddy construction will benefit a great number of people, as will doubling the time period residents can bring legal claims against developers for substandard workmanship. And nobody should be left living in an unlivable home. And whilst the Building Safety Bill cannot solve every problem on its own, and I'm sure there will be many further discussions to come, it is a bill I will be supporting and is a fundamental step in the right direction. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.
Thank you very much. Justin Matters.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. A place on the record, first of all, I'm co-chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Common Hold and Leasehold Reform, alongside the Right Honourable Member for Worthing West and the Honourable Member for St Albans, and the group, ably assisted by the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership, have been looking at these issues around building safety for some time. And we had a very informative meeting last week alongside the Fire Safety APPG with Ted Balliloo, who co-chaired the Victoria Cladding Task Force. And I have to say he gave a very frank and very compelling account of his experience when his state dealt with many of the issues that are covered by this bill. Put simply, if we take his advice, government are going to have to take a far bigger role in sorting this out than is currently envisaged, and they're also going to have to dig far deeper into their pockets than they already have. So I think it's better that we actually learn from his experience and bite the bullet on that now, rather than let things drift on unsatisfactorily for a few more years before succumbing to the inevitable. And I say that partly perhaps because the biggest concern is not the expense or the uncertainty, but the time it will take to get any kind of restitution, potentially years. The leaseholders cannot wait that long. A young couple who can't start a family, professional in fear of bankruptcy. Too many lives are on hold, and we cannot underestimate the mental toll of knowing every day you are living in a potential death trap, and there is nothing you can do at all to get out of that. These people cannot wait. So whilst the bill is a step in the right direction, it does feel that resolution for many is still going to be years off and may yet still come with a heavy price tag. I think the only certain winners from this legislation will actually be the lawyers, who will have a plethora of new legal avenues to argue over. So let's start with this extension of the limitation period. On the face of it, that's a positive thing, but it doesn't create any new rights, it only extends existing ones. And as the bill makes clear, the 15-year rule is only available if it somehow does not impact on the developer's human rights, which of course they're always going to claim it will. So field day number one with the lawyers arguing over that, and of course, critically, the extension is only available if the developer is still in business. As we know, many are not, and even if the extension does increase potentially the numbers of people who can take legal action, they're still going to face the same hurdles of expensive litigation. And if the developers are still in business and worth suing, then they're going to be in a far stronger position to fight the action than the leaseholders are. The inequality of arms in litigation will be immense. And despite the government's repeated promises in recent months, there are no guaranteed means of forcing regulators and developers, who are the architects of this crisis, from being held to account. As we know, that the inquiry into Grenfell continues, but it is already clear the materials used there should never have been used. Some of those materials were certified as safe at the time, but should never have been safe. Cladding systems have been designed by architects, planners and fire engineers. Costs were knowingly cut and safety concerns were ignored. Leaseholders are the only truly innocent party in this, but they still face the biggest burden to fix this mess, and that is wrong.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I rise in support of this bill. I think it introduces a number of crucial safeguards for residents whilst reforming the building safety system so that appropriate checks and balances are strengthened. Notably, the bill brings forward recommendations from the Dame Hackett review, and it adds to progress made by the Fire Safety Act and the greater clarification of rules concerning the use of EWS1 forms. Now, on that last point, the point regarding buildings under 18 metres no longer requiring an EWS1 form. I very much welcome the written ministerial statement that was provided to the House today. I believe that whilst it is probably slightly overdue, it's extremely welcome news, and it will go down very well with my constituents. Now, the bill contains many positive elements which I would have liked to have touched upon, but because of the time limit, I'm going to have to skip over those, because I do have a couple of concerns about the bill. And as my honourable friend, the member for Stevenage, first touched upon, the first of those relates to clause 124. Now, I agree with the principle that landlords must take cost recovery avenues to avoid passing on costs directly to leaseholders, given, of course, that they bear absolutely no responsibility for cladding being put on their buildings in the first place. However, there is no current legal obligation on landlords to seek cost recovery for remediation before passing them on to leaseholders. While the bill acknowledges this to be the case, it is insufficiently clear as to any potential remedy. Clause 124 stipulates that the landlord must seek other cost recovery avenues before passing these costs on. Well, what happens if they are unable to obtain such funding? What happens to the leaseholders then? What protections will be in place for them? The bill does not clarify this sufficiently. The London Fire Brigade have also highlighted a further issue which has potentially huge significance, which is that developers often open a subsidiary company when they are building new developments or refurbishing existing projects. When these projects are complete, the standard practice is for the subsidiary companies to close down, or to be closed down by the parent, and the parent company rarely retains legal liabilities for the premises that have been remediated. There is a danger that this will leave leaseholders liable for all costs resulting from negligent work by developers and their contractors. Now, having said that, Mr Deputy Speaker, I believe that these are issues that can be addressed as the bill proceeds through the House, and indeed I hope that the Minister in his closing remarks will be able to provide clarity on them today. In totality, I believe that this bill takes great strides in improving building safety, and I will be supporting it at second reading this evening, albeit with the hope that it may be strengthened as it proceeds.
Rachel Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Despite repeated promises to make buildings safe and protect leaseholders, and 4 years on from Grenfell, hundreds of thousands of people still live in unsafe homes and millions are caught up in the building safety crisis. Leaseholders are facing hundreds of pounds a month for service charges, insurance premiums, waking watch, before even getting into remediation costs. And then the government's Building Safety Fund excludes buildings under 18 metres. It isn't distributed on the basis of risk, and just 10 or 12p in every pound of the fund has been allocated. There's also uncertainty about who will cover the cost of other fire safety defects and interim safety costs. And in this debate, which has been very technical this afternoon, I appreciate that, but we must ensure that the voices of those leaseholders trapped in dangerous buildings are heard. And I want the Minister to hear testimonies from people in Luton South. Tom, who lives in the Point Red building, said, "We are left with terrible uncertainty, unable to move on with our lives, not knowing if we're going to be bankrupt and homeless by the end of the year. We sleep in a death trap every night." And this afternoon's statement and the added layer around the EWS1 forms is still another layer of uncertainty as it stands. Tom's a primary school teacher and his partner works with vulnerable children, the key workers we've relied on over the past 15 months, who are being forced to the edge of ruin month after month due to the life-ruining cost of fixing a problem they did not create. So will the Minister answer Tom's question? How does he propose that they raise money to pay the remediation costs that are not covered by government funding? It may be a shock to the other side of the House, but we don't all have trust funds or multiple assets to fall back on. The mental health of innocent leaseholders has severely deteriorated, and the government should ensure that they can access free support to reduce some of their anxieties and worries. The Building Safety Bill needed to include explicit legal protections to ensure that millions of pounds of building safety remediation costs are not passed on to innocent homeowners and tenants. And I support Labour's call for a new building works agency that would go block by block to identify which works need doing, and that would also fix, fund and crucially certify them as safe and sellable at the end, to allow leaseholders to finally move on with their lives. The Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee's report stated that it would be unacceptable and an abdication of responsibility to make leaseholders contribute a single penny towards the cost of remediating defects for which they were not responsible. It should not be the leaseholders' burden to bear. It's developers that created the crisis by putting profit before protections. How can it be that property developers who make millions each year are protected, while teachers, nurses, shop workers, transport workers, carers and pensioners are left to pick up the bill? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Video link, David Simmonds.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I very much welcome this bill, which is an extremely important step towards ending the anxiety that particularly has affected very large numbers of private leaseholders of modest means. And the comments of my honourable friend, the member for Orpington, in particular about the challenge posed by subsidiary companies, are ones that I very much support. But turning to a couple of other points, which it seems to me are important to make in the context of the passage of this bill. Local authorities on the whole have moved extremely swiftly to remediate any risks that occurred, both through measures such as waking watches and physical changes to buildings. And on the whole, the public sector has been very responsible in its role as a landlord, and also ensuring that the finance was there so that the work that was needed could be done. The private sector has been a much more mixed picture, and there are both developers who deserve praise for taking responsibility, even if it was not their fault and they had acted in good faith, to put right problems that pose risks to leaseholders. But clearly there are others who have chosen to walk away by putting businesses into liquidation. And whilst government cannot know the risks that are posed both the inside and the outside of every building and structure in the country, I would urge ministers to be as clear as possible, in particular with the finance and the property industry, about what the requirements to fulfil the expectations of this bill are. And the situation that some of my constituents faced with EWS1 forms, for example, was a result in many ways of a lack of clarity and understandable caution on the part of that industry of going for the belt and braces option, even though it was not required in the vast majority of transactions that were undertaken, which had the double effect of gumming up the system and also ensuring that people who really needed that work to be done could not find appropriately qualified professionals to do it. So can I urge that we are really, really clear about what is required and also what is not required. I'd also ask ministers to consider the representations from councils like my own, Hillingdon and Harrow, which have, in many cases, outstanding local authority building control departments, so that we can ensure that the recommendations for practical change that are outlined in the bill to ensure that building control work is done to the highest possible standard learns from the best practice that is already there in the market. That we make sure that those things that only government can do are done correctly and appropriately by government. And we also make sure that those at the sharp end, like local authorities, have the powers that they need. But overall, Mr. Deputy Speaker, a very positive step in the right direction.
Link. Sir Robert Neill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And it's a pleasure to follow my honourable friend and member for Ryseat Northwood. I agree with everything that he said, and also with the observations of my honourable friend and neighbour, the member for Orpington. The importance of getting these details right is absolutely critical. And I hope too that whilst welcoming the changes to the EWS1 forms, we can have clarity as to when that will come into force, because at the moment many contractors are sending people on RICS courses. Will that be needed in future? And secondly, what broader cultural change is going to be achieved within the sector? There's lots to welcome in the bill, and I shall support it at second reading, and particularly the establishment of a modernised framework of fire safety and regulation in buildings. Building safety overall, indeed, on the back of the Hackett Review, is a very important and very welcome reform. However, as again has been pointed out, there are areas where, frankly, the bill will require improvement. And the area around Clause 124 and the protection of leaseholders, especially where there are historic defects, remains a critical one here. Although much work has been done, and I recognise that much money has been put in by government, the problem is actually growing as more and more instances of substandard workmanship come to light. I've referred to North Point in my constituency on a number of occasions in this House, but to that now I can add, Mr. Deputy Speaker, residents in Iconia House and Isura House on Holmesdale Road, where defective cladding is now coming to light. 2 new builds, recent work in Ringers Road, William House and Henry House. So this is a scandal, frankly, of poor workmanship that will not go away, and the government is going to have to grasp the nettle even more ambitiously than it has so far. Where there is clear evidence that a developer has failed to build in accordance with the then extant regulations and in accordance with proper practice, then it is of course that they should be pursued and should pay. But there are problems in that practically, so you've got to have a solvent developer to go after in the first place. And in many cases, as has been pointed out, there is not. Where it transpires that buildings were built in accordance with the then regulations and those regulations were not themselves adequate or fit for purpose, then I have to say to the Minister, it's government that is the corporate owner of those regulations, and therefore government must bear the costs of meeting the undeserved loss to leaseholders who have acted entirely in good faith through all of this. There may be ways to try and recover that in due course, but the cash flow they do not have, particularly as they have unsellable, unmortgageable properties and already up to the eyeballs in debt because of the cost of waking watch. So there's still more that has to be done to this bill to improve the protections of leaseholders, and that's a message I think we need to give tonight.
Tanmanjeet Singh Dhesi.
Thank you very much. Mr. Deputy Speaker, since 2018, I have raised the issue of dangerous cladding on at least 7 different occasions in the House. Like the hundreds across my Slough constituency, I am frustrated with the lack of progress that has been made on ensuring we never have a repeat of the horrors of Grenfell and that our building safety regulations are overhauled. So I welcome the second reading of this building safety bill back to the House and its inclusion of steps which regulate and strengthen the quality and safety of building homes. Sadly, it's what this bill omits that concerns me most, namely the lack of concrete protections for leaseholders to ensure that they will not be responsible for fire safety costs. So I stand here today to repeat desperate pleas from residents in Slough and further beyond to a government which doesn't appear to be listening. From the occupants of West Central, Rivington Apartments, Lexington Apartments, Nova House, Kingswood House, Foundry Court, Ibex House, and I implore upon the government to pay attention, because, Mr. Deputy Speaker, protecting leaseholders is not only the right thing to do, but it's what has been repeatedly promised to them. 17 times ministers of government have reassured leaseholders that they should be shielded from fire safety costs, with the Prime Minister just last year noting that, and I quote, "No leaseholder should have to pay for the unaffordable costs of fixing safety defects that they did not cause and are no fault of their own." So my question to the Minister is, where will these legal protections actually come from? As it currently stands, leaseholders could still be liable for costs after the building owner has, and I quote, "explored alternative cost recovery routes." Characteristically, the government's response is delayed, limited and inept. We need a national cladding task force to truly establish the extent of dangerous cladding, supported by a building works agency to certify work as safe so that flats can become sellable and action is taken against those who caused the crisis in the first place. Leaseholders and local councils such as Slough Borough Council should not be responsible for remediation costs. Leaseholders did not build their homes, nor clad it in dangerous materials, and they certainly did not approve them as safe. Their only crime is saving tirelessly and fulfilling their dream of home ownership. And how have they been rewarded, Mr. Deputy Speaker? By going to bed at night in fear for their lives. An ever-growing bill to simply make their homes fire safe, and the looming risk of bankruptcy and the loss of their jobs as a result. So I call upon the government to act with urgency. For the hundreds of thousands still suffering, we need to definitively end this nightmare for those in Slough and further beyond within our country. Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Very much. Now I've got 5 video links, one after the other, and the first one is Marco Longhi.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Always a pleasure to see you in the chair. I have worked in construction over several years, during which time I was involved in the construction of fuel retail stations, houses and flats. I have also worked on oil rigs. I should note for the register of interest that I am also a landlord, so ensuring homes and other buildings are safe is something which is very, very real to me. My experience has given me some insight into building safety and fire safety in particular, and I've often witnessed a disconnect between policymakers, developers, building inspectors and home buyers. Day-to-day practicalities can show up well-meaning policies to be out of touch, and it is home buyers who always face the consequences of this reality. So, Mr. Speaker, the Minister will know of my support for what the government is trying to achieve, and it does make complete sense to target remedial activity at buildings posing the highest risk. But there remains a question of fairness, which is quite separate to risk. A careful balance needs to be struck, as both taxpayer and leaseholders have no fault in what has happened, and yet it seems that both may be suffering financial consequences. So while small buildings generally face lower safety risks, this should not mean that leaseholders should be financially worse off for living in them compared to those in higher rise ones. Developers, specifiers, inspecting bodies and insurance companies should be paying up. That is why it is so important that the bill seeks to tackle bad practice head-on, and especially via the introduction of retrospective action on substandard homes. Inspections have also highlighted further building faults, such as missing fire breaks, wooden balconies and combustible insulation. The repair cost alone could be more than £25,000 per flat. There is no provision for support with these repairs, which will be required before a fire safety certificate can be issued, unless this of course has perhaps changed due to the statement today. Home buyers would not be privy to these liabilities, as the conveyancing process would not have highlighted the possibility of these risks even existing at point of purchase. Risk awareness at the conveyancing stage for all manner of risks is something that I raised in my 10-minute rule bill. We need a bill that will deliver a more robust regulatory system that will ensure that all homes are built to the highest safety standards, so no one is ever left feeling unsafe in their home again, and the regulatory system must itself be accountable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marco. Now, the next video link, Geraint Devies.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, 4 years on from the Grenfell disaster, hundreds of thousands are still left in unsafe homes, left trapped in blocks, unable to move or to sell their properties, in ongoing chronic uncertainty with the added trauma of thinking they could be consumed by fire. This is not their fault. They are not able to fund the works and they are not able to recover the costs. The answer is clear. Only the government is in a position to assess the work, fund it, fix it, and then recover the costs in a systematic way as appropriate from insurers and developers, or to fund the residue from taxpayers. Individuals are not in this position. If the cost of this in totality in the first instance was, say, £15 billion, much of this, of course, would be recovered, then the cost of that in the first instance would be the interest on that of around £150 million a year. This government is saving this year £14 billion a year in interest costs on debt because of lower interest rates. So in fact, this cost, the 150 million to fund the 15 billion to fund everything, would basically represent 1% of the savings they've made this year. So it's completely wrong and unnecessary that they should dither and delay. That people's lives have been blighted. Their finances have been torpedoed, their mental health is in tatters, and it's completely unnecessary. The government subsidised second home purchases with stamp duty in England to a total of something like £5 billion. That was completely unnecessary because interest rates actually went down with COVID and there was no need to prop up the housing market. So much for levelling up. If they're serious about levelling up, they should put their money where their mouth is. They should basically support first-time buyers, low-income homeowners who've been left in this paralysis. They should immediately evaluate, as they are in Wales with the Welsh government, fund it, fix it, and then recover the costs from the developers and insurers. There's no excuse for delay. Justice should be done, and people are rightly angry, and I'd be happy to join them outside Parliament in protest before it becomes illegal in the autumn to do it. Let's get moving and get people sorted out on this tragic issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Geraint. Next video link, Maria Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and can I welcome this bill today, which really requires a fundamental overhaul to our building industry's attitude towards the quality of new homes. For too long, the biggest 5 builders have squeezed out smaller local homeowners, home builders whose reputation for quality is central to their business. And this bill, I think, makes build quality central to everyone's business. But first and foremost in the debate today, we need to speak up for those who've been impacted by the building industry's current fire safety regulatory failure. Those directly affected by the tragedy at Grenfell are always in our minds, but also the people who own homes in high-rise flats. They continue to shoulder the worry resulting from construction works that have failed fire safety tests. And the government has acted very rapidly, and many residents have already benefited from the government's £5 billion fund for remedial works, particularly the Waking Watch Relief Fund. Building operators have also been able to get in-principle agreements for significant fire safety remedial works, but the worry for residents remains because some building owners might be cautious about starting remedial works without clear sight of what happens if additional problems are discovered. Now, I don't think the government can write a blank cheque. So what additional assurances can the Minister give? Because this legislation isn't explicit in stopping freeholders from passing on the costs of remedial works to leaseholders. Back in 2017, residents raised with me concerns about domestic fire alarm systems in high-rise buildings and the lack of understanding amongst residents about how they work. So I'm really pleased to see reflected in this bill today my 10-minute rule bill of March 2018, which required residents of high-rise buildings to be provided with far more fire safety information. There are some other issues that have been raised with me by my constituents, particularly how complex building ownership structures can be dealt with, particularly where they allow owners to be disconnected from the issue of fire safety in the buildings they own. Could this be referred to the building safety regulator? Disabled and vulnerable people need to be able to visit and leave a building if a fire occurs. Is the Minister looking further at personal evacuation plans to see that they're up to scratch? I very much welcome the new Homes Ombudsman, something called for in 2015 by the APBG on the built environment, a report which I co-chaired following problems my constituents had experienced with build quality. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I really support this bill, but residents need us to recognise the worries they still have. By putting in place a £5 billion fund to cover remedial works, the government's clear they don't want these costs to fall on the shoulders of leaseholders. So what more can be said to make this clearer?
Thank you very much. The next video link, Daniel Zeichner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a bill that is both welcome in that we've been waiting for it so long and totally unwelcome in that we all know that it isn't going to solve so many of the problems. And on behalf of so many of my constituents who have been locked in an absolute nightmare, I have to say I'm incandescent with rage at this government's utter hopelessness. I'm not the only one. MPs across the House will have had the same conversations, the same site visits. A couple of years ago for me, it was Berkeley Homes, hugely expensive properties in the centre of Cambridge. Lovely looking properties, but catastrophically poorly constructed. So much so, they literally had to be taken apart. And as that was done, revealing the slapdash built on the Cavalier, joists hanging in the air not connected to anything, pipes not connected, waste water expected to run uphill. And when exasperated purchasers looked to those who had made a fortune out of them to offer some help, met with a wall of denial, of obfuscation, the only wall that was reliably sound. And then HBC and other organisations supposedly there to provide redress, well, they were partners in crime. Unbelievable, one might have thought. And where was the local building control? Well, that had been outsourced too. Rip-off Tory Britain, complete with massive funds from those developers. We used to think it was other countries that had corrupt systems. Well, I'm afraid that's what we have here, a corrupt, broken system. The question is, do the measures in this bill give any hope for the future? The new Homes Ombudsman has been waited for almost as long as I've been in this place. Goodness knows how many times it's been promised. But if it's finally going to happen, then good. But there's nothing here to address past failures. I named one developer in Cambridge, but frankly, I could name most of them. Barratt, Countryside, Bovis. It's a long list of shame. Twice in the last few weeks, I've been in Trumpington with distraught residents looking at sloppy work and areas left unfinished. The skate park, which got the developer the planning permission, but now the kids have to scramble over fences and fight through the weedy undergrowth and past the dead trees that were never watered to get to it. And no one ever takes responsibility because everything is subcontracted. How convenient. The only problem is the unfortunate residents can't subcontract living there. Maybe we should arrange a house swap with some of those who have made such rich pickings. So much more to be said, but let me make one particular observation raised by the LGA, the provision for duty holders to choose their building control regulator. As the LGA say, by requiring regulators to remain in competition with approved inspectors for the majority of buildings, the bill leaves in place one of the root causes of the current crisis. Well, absolutely it does. It beggars belief that this should be allowed to continue. The LGA go on. Compliance with regulation cannot be a commodity, and local authority building control should not be left to tackle non-compliance in buildings over 18 metres, while simultaneously having to compete with private businesses who work in out-of-scope buildings, often owned by the same developers. Just think about that phrase, compliance with regulations as a commodity. It really is absurd. I want independence. It really isn't complicated. And the fact that the party opposite can't grasp that simple fact goes to the heart of why they're totally unfit to be in charge.
Thank you very much. And now the next video link, Florence Eshalomi.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And I'm pleased to speak in this long-awaited debate on such an important bill. And I'd like to put on record how disrespectful it was both to members of this House and to leaseholders, that the Secretary of State chose to release details of a major policy shift just minutes before this debate began, making proper scrutiny of it impossible. And I ask that he urgently clarifies whether his new announcement on EWS1 forms for buildings under 18 metres will apply retrospectively. Since I was elected 18 months ago, I have raised the issue of dangerous cladding with fire safety ministers in this House on 14 separate occasions. And each time I've raised it, the government's answer to my question has always been the same. Wait for the Building Safety Bill to come to Parliament. Mr Deputy Speaker, I welcome the elements of this bill that strengthen the fire safety regime for high-rise buildings. But I'm afraid the legislation before us today is woefully short of what is required properly to address all the issues facing leaseholders. It fails to protect them from extortionate charges for interim safety watch. It fails to ensure that their homes are mortgageable so that they have a basic right to move. And instead of rescuing leaseholders from this financial nightmare, this bill enshrines in law additional costs in the form of a new building safety charge, estimated to cost leaseholders up to £42 a month. £42 a month, which many of them can simply not afford. That is why my question to the Secretary of State is urgent and needs clarification. Home ownership is an aspiration to be applauded, and yet leaseholders who bought their homes in good faith have simply been hung out to dry. I would also like to echo the comments from the Right Honourable Member for Basingstoke about fire evacuation plans for disabled leaseholders. Where will this be addressed? I hope the Minister will reflect on all the injustices and take time, and as they take time over the summer to relax. Unfortunately, for a number of my constituents, they don't have this same luxury. They are still living in these dangerous buildings, wondering how on earth they will address this and pay for these costs. Ministers promised that the Building Safety Bill would finally address this cladding scandal, and I would urge them to think again and end this cladding scandal nightmare for our leaseholders.
Thank you very much. Richard Burgon.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And 4 years on from the Grenfell fire, a fire that killed 72 people and shone a tragic light on the reality of how race, class and inequality shape the lives of working class people in our country, we are still yet to see the changes needed to make housing safe. 4 years later, hundreds of thousands of people are still living with unsafe cladding and other fire safety problems. Millions are caught up in the wider building safety crisis, and yet the government has had to be dragged, kicking and screaming for any small steps forward in this bill, a bill still riddled with major flaws and that must be amended as it passes through this House. This bill, together with the statement the Secretary of State has published today, is, as it stands, a betrayal of those who needed the government to step in and support them following Grenfell. Despite Conservative ministers' promises, many leaseholders are still having to pay, and without decisive government action, they will pay more in the future. Legal advice for the Labour Party found this bill would make it more likely, not less likely, that leaseholders would have to pick up the costs of fixing cladding issues. So 4 years on from Grenfell, what explains the inadequacies of this bill before us today? What explains the 4 years of foot-dragging, the 4 years of refusal to deliver the protections that leaseholders need? This year, dodgy contracts have been exposed and the stench of corruption has grown ever stronger, with polls showing that most people see this government as corrupt. Well, those people won't be reassured by the fact that developers who build flats with unsafe cladding have donated £2.5 million to the Conservatives since Grenfell, and that Conservative MPs have then voted time after time after time to block amendments to protect leaseholders from the cost of removing dangerous cladding. Nor will they be reassured that, according to the anti-corruption body Transparency International, £1 in every £5 donated to the Conservative Party since 2010 came from those with substantial interests in the housing market. And of course, we have a housing secretary who admitted to unlawfully signing off a £1 billion housing project which saved a Conservative Party donor millions of pounds. Mr Deputy Speaker, the Tory MPs and the government, if they want, can show that they are not in the pocket of developers by backing the amendments that will come to ensure that the cost of building safety remediation are not passed on to innocent homeowners and tenants. I do think it's remarkable, if the Minister himself weren't here, that not a single Conservative MP would be on the benches today. Not good enough. Back those amendments to improve this bill.